Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar. Today we are going to talk about how to close out the year strong with QuickBooks. And my name is Errol. I am the product education specialist at Method, but I will just be hosting. The real stars of today will be Elish and Brad, and I'm not going to bother trying to explain who they are. Let's just have them do it themselves. Let's start off with Elish.
Hey everyone. So my name is Elish McCann, and I also work at Method alongside Errol. If you guys aren't familiar with Method, we're best known for being the #1 QuickBooks CRM. So more on that later. But if you've ever been on any of our webinars before, I might be a familiar face. And yeah, we're going to get into a lot of great QuickBooks tips to kind of help you settle up for 2022 and move on to 2023. So excited to get into that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Brad.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and glad that you guys showed up for this webinar. My name is Brad White. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at VARC Solutions, and basically been in the QuickBooks world for over 25 years. Really spent a lot of my time in the desktop version and also the last 15 years or so in the QuickBooks Online version. But our firm does everything there is to do with QuickBooks, bookkeeping services, accounting services, cleanups, migrations, you name it. So when you think of QuickBooks, think of us. That's what we do.
Great. Thank you so much. This webinar will go for about 45 minutes, but we will leave time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions that you want to ask, you can actually even put them in the question box on the right in your GoToWebinar control panel, or you can leave them till the end and throw them there, but we will give time to answer those questions as well. So without further ado, let's get started. And let's talk about our very first question about what year-end challenges do QuickBooks users face, because we're getting close to the end of the year. Brad, let's hear from you.
Well, I will say this, it's a busy time of year anyways, right? It's like you've got holidays, you've got people taking time off, you're taking time off, and it just seems like in the end of the year is always just incredibly stressful and busy. Not as always relaxing, as we all want it to be. But from an accounting standpoint, from a bookkeeping standpoint, when we work with clients, one of the things we see is just this mad flurry of activity at the very, very end of the year playing catch up, right? So, maybe I've just been entering transactions throughout the year, but I really haven't spent time reconciling my bank accounts, reconciling my credit card accounts. And so, that might have been put off. We're all too busy, right? And so at the end of the year, it's, oh crap, I haven't, reconciled in the last 3-4 months. So a lot of that type of end of the year catching up really does kind of tend to put a squeeze on everything. And that's also the time when most internal accounting departments are trying to get the last month of the year closed out so they can get the books over to their accountant for to start, getting ready for tax season. But so, because most of the year it's just kind of business as usual, but that end of the year is really, really kind of cramped. I would also say from a bookkeeping firm perspective that it's also really the busiest time of the year for us. We don't really have an off season when it comes to the December, January period, because that for a lot of our clients is the time when they're changing systems, right? Maybe they used a different payroll system and now they're switching. You don't do that in the middle of the year typically, right? You do that January 1st. So that creates a lot of activity right then. Or maybe you're implementing a time tracking system, or you're migrating, right, from one system to another system. And if it's accounting related, that is one of those things that we help clients with, but it's a very challenging time of year.
I bet. And trying to clean up and get everything ready, prepared for the end of the year is going to be challenging. So thank you very much, Brad. Let's go on to our next question. So how can you enhance your reports in QuickBooks? And we'll go with Elish next.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Errol. So Brad is going to get a lot deeper into some QuickBooks specific reporting tips in just a second. But I do have two kind of, I would say, best practices to share just before we dive into the QuickBooks stuff. So first, QuickBooks, of course, it's a great hub of accounting information, a lot of awesome default fields and data that you're already tracking, which is super powerful. I would, however, challenge you to think about maybe some more, I guess, like custom or unique fields that are really important to your business, your specific niche that you want to be tracking as well, and make sure you have some sort of system in place to actually capture that information. Historical data is really powerful, but of course you don't have it if you're not tracking the right stuff. So that would be my first recommendation. And then second to reporting, super valuable exercise. You know, the data analysis can take time and stuff, so why not automate your reporting process as much as you can. So QuickBooks has some functionality there. There's also lots of other tools like Method that can help you out there. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Brad.
Yeah, good stuff, by the way. And it's a similar story when it comes to like the reporting in QuickBooks. I think one of the simplest recommendations is to run your reports and actually look at them. Okay. Most companies don't do that on a regular basis, right? You know, a lot of the clients that we work with, they're very, very simple, right? I mean, some of them are very simple. It's like, hey, do I have money in the bank account? I'm good. You know, is my, do I have money for payroll? I'm good, right? Beyond that, you know, you might look at the reports every once in a while, but for a lot of companies, it really is that simple. Do I have the money? So enhancing the reports really starts with just running them and looking at them. Kind of going back to an earlier point, I think a lot of people just kind of get an autopilot during the year, you know, so they're recording transactions, they're adding customers, they're adding vendors, they're adding items and maybe accounts to their chart of accounts. And it really does take someone, you know, looking at the chart of accounts, looking at the financials with just kind of a fresh set of eyes to go, you know, have redundant entries been added accidentally, right? You know, we've got, you know, Bob Smith and Bob Space Smith and Smith comma Bob, and you know, you see those types of things when you run, you know, some of the sales and customer reports, or you know, maybe in the chart of accounts, you know, somebody said, oh, hey, I got a, you know, bill for supplies, so they'll go in and write a, you know, enter a bill or write a check, and it'll be office supplies, and then 3 months later they're doing another one, and it's supplies for the office, you know, pencils and pens. And so those just kind of things just kind of creep in over time because we're really not, you know, maybe not thinking about it. We're not really paying attention to it as much. And so really, again, just the recommendation is to run the reports, review the reports, and see things like that. I would also say just from like a trend perspective, you know, the standard reports in QuickBooks is, you know, your P&L, your balance sheet, things like that. But you can also run a P&L by month and see some of the trends that you might otherwise not notice. And that could be seasonal stuff for you. It could be industry specific type of trend, but it also can help you catch errors. And I'll give you a good example. So maybe you've got like a monthly insurance expense or rent expense or different things like that you expect to be consistent over time. You know, one of the concepts in the accounting world is to put things in the right accounting period, and so in a perfect world, yeah, you'd have that monthly expense every single month on that P&L by month. But what happens sometimes is, you know, you enter that bill at the beginning of the month and you get another bill and it might get entered the last day of the same month, and so now on a P&L you've got, you know, $200, and the next month you've got $0 when it should have been, you know, like 100 and 100. You know, running a P&L by month is a perfect example of how you'd see that stuff, you know, and if you're really looking at it, you go, oh, maybe there's a mistake there, or maybe we entered a transaction, or maybe we didn't enter a transaction. So that's the kind of thing that we typically look at and help clients with, and help make sure that your financials are accurate.
I think
Amazing.
too, just
Sorry.
some of Brad's points, Errol, if you don't mind. I think we hear the cliche like data is the new gold all the time, but it's really what you do with that information. And if you're not doing anything with it, what's the value? So I'd also recommend for the audience out there today to take advantage of like dashboards or any other features or functionalities that really summarize your data so that you're not doing all this manual analysis and then actioning it. You can kind of cut that analysis step out or reduce it a ton. But with that, back to you, Errol.
No, that's great to hear. And I also like pretty graphs. Every time Elish shares her data with me, I always ask her to make it into a pretty graph because I like graphs. Anyway, thank you so much, Brad and Elish. Let's go on to our next, which is a very important question, is like, how Can you keep your QuickBooks data clean? Elish, I think this is an important one.
Yeah, definitely. So I can start us off. I would say my first and maybe biggest tip would be to keep your QuickBooks access tight. You don't need too many cooks in the kitchen. That's always a recipe for disaster. So just make sure your key stakeholders are really the only ones that have access to QuickBooks. A lot of things can go wrong from a data, integrity perspective, security as well. So I would just recommend only having your key people in QuickBooks who absolutely need access. When it comes to maybe some other teams like sales, for example, who can benefit from some QuickBooks data but don't need access to the whole file, I would also recommend taking a look at tools that integrate and are maybe more sales applications versus accounting software for your sales team to leverage so that they can get the different data points that they need from QuickBooks without having access to your whole file. Beyond that, I would say you only really want to be putting your accounting data in QuickBooks. I know it's the first tool a lot of small businesses go for, and that's great. It's a strong foundation. But once you start moving into things like customer management and stuff like that, you don't want to be putting everything in QuickBooks. It's going to make it really messy, really cluttered. I know Brad's team at VARC does a lot of QuickBooks cleanup at the end of the year. So let's make their lives easier by keeping your accounting data in QuickBooks and using other systems or tools for everything else. You want to go with kind of that best of breed approach, whether it's your HR information, whether it's your sales information, customer information, all that jazz. So those would be my tips, but I'll pass it over to Brad.
Thanks. And good, again, great advice. I mean, I've really got two primary suggestions in this area. First off, the best tool in the accounting toolbox is the bank rec. Going in and doing a bank reconciliation or credit card reconciliation, that is where you find a lot of the mistakes. It's really just that simple, right? If I'm not going in and reconciling my checkbook, I'm just sort of trusting that the bank is right. I'm trusting that the transactions got into QuickBooks and they're right. But that isn't always the case. Even if you've got transactions flowing directly into your QuickBooks from your bank account, it doesn't mean they're coded correctly, and there's rules and automations and things like that that can help, but it doesn't mean the data is right. The number total might be right, but how it's being coded might not be correct. Okay, so those are things obviously to look at. But it's by doing the bank reconciliation, that's when you find a lot of the problems. You find the duplicate transactions. I entered a check, the owner got in trying to be helpful, right? And they entered another check, same check twice. That's the kind of stuff you'd see in a reconciliation. The other thing you're going to see is duplicate transactions. You also find missing ones, right? You're going to find a deposit on the bank rec that you didn't enter. So bank recs really need to be like, that's the top of the list. That's the first thing you need to do to make sure the data is clean. And really the second part, this is what I would call maybe a little bit more on the advanced side of things. I mean, it's actually pretty simple, but for most QuickBooks users, it's not something that's being thought about or looked at very closely. And that's the account mapping on the items or the products and services list. Okay, so here's just pardon me for going a little into the weeds on this, but I think it's really important. QuickBooks, you're not having to think debits or credits because there's transactions, right? Well, invoices, estimates, things like that are item-based or they're product and service-based. And so the way QuickBooks does the accounting behind the scenes is by making sure that the account mapping on those products and services or those items is correct. QuickBooks is going to do whatever you tell it to do through that account mapping. So I'm going to give you a couple specific examples just to kind of get real solid and clear on this one. But I'll give you an example. So let's say you're in the construction industry and one of the things that you do is like demolition or junk removal service. Okay, so that might be something you're charging your client for, or your customer for. Well, if you look at that junk removal service that you've got in your item list, it has a couple pointers typically in it, or an accounting pointer in it. So for example, there's always going to be an income side, but there also might be an expense side. So where is that junk removal service pointing to in terms of income? It should be linked to something like cleanup services income, okay? But it might not be. It might be linked to something else incorrectly. What if you pay subcontractors to do that junk removal service for you or that demolition service for you. Traditionally, if it's a subcontractor, that would need to be an expense account, something like construction or contract labor. Okay, but again, it might not be right. So that's an example of the type of thing you'd want to look at. So if things aren't flowing to the financial statements correctly, it's probably because of the account mapping. I'll give you one more, a little bit more advanced example, and that's, let's say you're in your business, you sell products. It's a little bit more complex. It's not just income and expenses. Now you've got assets when you buy it, income when you sell it, and cost of goods sold, where the value of that asset gets moved to cost of goods sold when you sell it. Well, just think, if I'm not pointing that product to the right asset account, it's not going to show up correctly on the balance sheet. You know, if I don't have it mapped to the right income or cost of goods sold account, my profit and loss is not going to be clean or accurate. And so that's the kind of thing you really want to look at in detail. And there's different ways that you can make that really, really clear on your item list to evaluate that. But that's a really critical piece for QuickBooks and how QuickBooks works. Not every accounting program works the same way. So I think that's probably one of the unique parts of QuickBooks that you really do need to look at.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brad. And I don't mind if you go into the weeds, right? It gives more practical advice and real world examples to help us with. So I'm all for it, Brad. Okay, let's go on. And our next one is, how can QuickBooks users get more out of the tool? Let's go back to you, Brad.
All right. Well, this is another great topic. So thanks, Errol. So when we're focused on QuickBooks right here, right now, right? So how can QuickBooks users get more out of the tool? Okay. I think the first thing to make sure is that you're in the right version of QuickBooks. Okay. So QuickBooks Desktop, there's 3 different versions of QuickBooks Desktop. There's Pro, Premier, and Enterprise. QuickBooks Online actually has 4 versions. So one, it's like picking, you know, the right version to be in, whether it's a desktop version or the cloud version. That's important. Making sure you're at the right level within that version is also important, because it could be that you're in a program in a version that's more than you need. Okay, or maybe you're in one that, you know, if you pay just a little bit more money into it, you know, you might unlock that very specific feature that you've been needing, and it would save your staff a lot of time. But so that's something that really should be evaluated at least once a year, just to go, hey, are we in the right version? Okay. I know a lot of people, especially, you know, QuickBooks Desktop's been around for a lot longer, you know, and they might have looked at QuickBooks Online 10 years ago and said, I don't like it, or whatever. It's changed a lot. Every year they're adding features, they're adding enhancements, they're making it more robust. So that would be the first thing, really, is looking at what version you're in. Is it the right version, and evaluating, you know, when is it right to move to the cloud and things like that. The second thing I would say is also just to realize that QuickBooks isn't a do everything system. Okay, it doesn't do everything that a business might need. It's great at the accounting, right? It's great at being able to create an invoice, run your financials, right? But it's not a CRM system, right? It's not a very robust inventory management system or warehouse management system. So there's things that it just can't do on its own. So I think there is some value in integrating with kind of best-in-class systems, and that's why we recommend the method system for the CRM side. And I know Elish, you're going to talk more about that, but that's just an example where you'd want to use some of those best-in-class solutions. And I'll mention one more that I think is, again, it's really important, not just to get more out of the tool, but also to safeguard your data. So in terms of like backups. So let's say you're on QuickBooks Desktop. Okay, are your backups in place? Are they working? Have you checked? Those are important questions to ask. The calls that we get frantically, you know, throughout the year are, oh crap, you know, my computer hard drive crashed. I think I've lost my data. Can you help me get it back? You know, the first question is, where's your backup, right? And a lot of times, it's very unfortunate, but a lot of times the answer is, well, you know, John in IT was supposed to be making sure that was happening, but it wasn't, right? So those are things, and that's one. And then online, QuickBooks Online Advanced has a built-in backup system. But one of the service add-ons that we recommend for QBO is a backup service called Rewind, and it does it works on all versions of QuickBooks Online, but it also does transactional level restores. So literally, you could pick a specific transaction that might not have been entered correctly and restore it. Restore that one transaction as an example, as opposed to let me restore everything back to what it was last week and then have to re-enter stuff, right? So it's a really good tool. We have a 7-day free trial that we can help clients with too. So if you just want to kick the tires and evaluate it, but those are some of the suggestions that I have.
Great. I can jump in there. Brad touched on a ton of great points. I think too, once you get to the point where you're like so confident you're in the right version of QuickBooks and you have all kind of that data security best practices in place, what we often see with our clients at Method is that you're growing your business, you're scaling, and QuickBooks just isn't enough anymore. And we like to refer to that as growing pains, right? So QuickBooks is an amazing hub for your accounting workflows and data. But when you start trying to, push other processes into QuickBooks, that's where a lot of issues come up, a lot of things with cleanup at end of year, and just like frustrations from your team because QuickBooks isn't doing stuff that it wasn't designed to do. So apps.com is a great resource for any of you out there, especially if you're on QuickBooks Online. There's also the desktop apps marketplace, which the same thing for QuickBooks desktop versions. But all of those apps on there are best in breed applications. So they focus really, in a very focused way. They're on different workflows and they specialize in them. So what you're getting there is apps that have been vetted not only by QuickBooks and Intuit's team, but also QuickBooks users just like yourself. And you can test out a lot of those with free trials as well, like Brad mentioned. And Method is one of them. So if sales automation is something that you're struggling with, we specialize in automating kind of any back-end operational processes and the customer experience as well. I know, especially post-pandemic, a digital customer experience has been something that a lot of small businesses really need to compete, and that's something we're happy to help with. That's it for me, Errol.
Great. Thank you so much, Elish and Brad. Let's go on to the next question. How do you know if your bottom line is accurate? Which is real. I can't even keep track of what day we're on. Thank you for reminding me the webinar was today. So yes, how can we keep our bottom line accurate? Let's start again with Brad.
Well, so beyond some of the basics we already talked about, like in terms of reconciling, I will say two specific areas that are kind of gotchas in QuickBooks is sales tax and payroll. QuickBooks has built-in ways of tracking sales tax and payroll liabilities and things like that. But what's also unique about QuickBooks is there is a right way and a wrong way to pay sales tax, and a right way and a wrong way to pay payroll liabilities. And you may be quote unquote doing it the wrong way in your financials, your chart of account balances might be accurate, but those are kind of like modules within QuickBooks, and they have their own unique reporting, right? So there's sales tax reporting, there's payroll reporting, and if you're not paying sales and payroll taxes the right way, the payroll reporting might not be right, or the sales tax reporting might not be right, even if your financials and the totals are right. So that's just one of those things that we like to, when we review accounts, we like to run some of those matching reports to see if the numbers are right, because that could indicate, oh, somebody's just paying it the wrong way. So that's one. And here's maybe the last point I'll say about that is I think QuickBooks markets itself as a software program that non-accountants can use. Okay, so you don't need to be CPA to use QuickBooks. You don't have to be a formally trained accountant to use QuickBooks. But the problem is most small businesses, they've got their mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, cousin, aunt, sister's brother, cousin, doing the accounting because it's cheap labor. Okay, it's less expensive. But a lot of times that introduces mistakes that you're just not aware of because you aren't a formally trained accountant or bookkeeper. So those are some of the trade-offs, right? To having a program that doesn't require, to be an accounting professional, it's also easy to make mistakes. So from my perspective, making sure that the bottom line is accurate is getting some one-on-one help, a second set of eyes on your books, really, just to look at the financials, look at the details, and see what might not be being done correctly. Because it's like we all make mistakes. I make mistakes every day, and even the best bookkeepers in the world, they make a mistake every once in a while. So to think about a normal quote unquote QuickBooks user, they're going to make a few more mistakes, and those are things that we can help kind of catch.
That's great. Thank you so much, Brad. I know I don't trust my mom anywhere near the computer, so it is good to have that second pair of eyes. And I do see we do have a couple questions, but before we go on to those questions, just in case anyone is interested with VRC solutions, Brad, what's one way that they could get started working with you?
Great question. So just in general, obviously we are a bookkeeping firm, so we do that type of work for clients around the country. That's a regular part of what we do, as much or as little as a client needs. But I would say, invest a little bit of money in a file review. So that's something that we do for clients. A lot of times at the end of the year, a lot of times at the beginning of the next year, looking at the last year's worth of stuff. But we've got a 48-point checklist of very, very granular detailed stuff that we go through, where we're ticking and tying and we're checking all this stuff to make sure that those duplicates and the trends and all those types of things are looked at. But really the key is to make sure that any errors are identified and fixed. We don't want those flowing into the tax process and then finding out 6 months later we've got to do an amended return, because we didn't catch them early enough, right? So those things can be costly if we don't find them. So we recommend absolutely doing an end of the year file review. People can call us, you can email us, you can go to our website, varcsolutions.com, and reach out to us, and we'll love to schedule a file review with you.
There's a handy link in the chat there as well for the VARC QuickBooks file review, so feel free to check that out. And Brad actually did share that 48-point checklist with me, and it's very in-depth, very detailed. It looks like good stuff, so definitely don't hesitate on that. Errol?
Oh, it's over to you, Elish. Can you tell us a bit more on how Method works with QuickBooks?
Perfect. Of course, thanks, Errol. So Method, we work with QuickBooks users all the time. We sync very deeply with both QuickBooks Online as well as desktop. So no matter kind of the version that you're using, we're happy to work with you. We actually have a patent on our QuickBooks Desktop sync, which not a lot of people can say. But yeah, really where we help QuickBooks users is when you are experiencing those QuickBooks growing pains. Growth is great, but it can be painful. So we are here to help. So we do a lot of workflow automation that QuickBooks doesn't actually offer for things like your estimates, invoice, customer communication, all of that jazz. And what's really fun is that we are actually a no-code platform. So for all of you non-technical folks out there like myself, you don't need to know how to code to actually tailor the solution to your small business, and we can help you do that if that's of interest. So we do have a free trial. You can check us out at method.me. And yeah, that's about it, Errol.
Great. Okay. So I think it's a good time for people to pick your brains. We have experts online. So let's go on to some questions that we have. I do see at least a couple of questions on there. I think both of you have access to the questions. Hopefully you do.
Yeah,
Brad
I can get started on this one, Errol. So I see we have a question from Kuga about why QuickBooks has so many third-party apps and why can't QuickBooks incorporate all of them for convenience? So I think I have two thoughts on this, and then I'll pass it over to Brad. The first is we do see QuickBooks through acquisition acquiring some of these apps that specialize in different industries. So a few that come to mind are T-Sheets. That's kind of QuickBooks' preferred choice for time tracking capabilities. There's also TradeGetco, which I believe they do inventory management. So they were acquired a few years ago by Intuit. And then most recently, we've seen MailChimp, which is more of a marketing automation tool that we also integrate here with at Method. So I think they are slowly trying to build that whole small business suite, but it does take time. And then my second point is I think even if they did create this complete full suite that covers every kind of niche. I think like, your small business yourself, you are very different from your competitors, even people in completely different industries. So I think even if they were offering a completely holistic small business suite, it wouldn't work for everybody. And I think that's kind of where choice is kind of a little bit powerful. And what's nice with the QuickBooks ecosystem, the apps on there, you do know that they're vetted. So it does give you at least like a short list to work with. So that's my recommendation, but I'll pass it over to Brad.
Yeah, honestly, I would mimic a lot of what you said. Because you're spot on that. As somebody who has worked with QuickBooks and Intuit as a partner at different levels for the last 25 years, I can tell you that is a trend, right? They will make they'll make a software that is good enough for most people, right? But they're not trying to be all things to all people, and I think that's actually, I mean, and it's an inconvenience sometimes, having to integrate an app, but it's also to your benefit ultimately, because there are people out there so incredibly gifted and talented at a very, very specialized thing, right? And they think about that all day, every day. And they build solutions that are super, super robust, solving that thing incredibly well, right? QuickBooks is never going to have that level of focus and robustness on those kind of niche type of solutions. I'll give you an example. So like inventory, QuickBooks Online is not a great solution on its own for QuickBooks for inventory management, for warehouse management, for pick, pack, ship, for e-commerce integration. I mean, there's so many things that clients are trying to do. And so, Intuit is partnered with Deer Inventory System, fantastic solution, and it's incredibly robust. Expecting QuickBooks to come out with that type of solution and just drop it in and say, here it is, it works for everybody, is typically not very well. It's just not going to happen. Just not going to happen, because folks like Deere are spending tons and tons and tons of hours building out their system. Method is the exact same way in terms of that CRM system and just the contact management and giving your salespeople more power, but not having them live in QuickBooks, things like that, because not everybody wants to be in QuickBooks. I mean, Elish, you kind of made this point earlier. We don't always want our sales and purchasing people and project managers in our accounting system. And so sometimes there's actually a side benefit to having it be an add-on, okay? But I'll just add one more to the example you used before, Elish, where you talked about T-Sheets, QuickBooks Time, and MailChimp. Was it last year or 2 years ago, Intuit had a partnership with Fathom. Okay, so Fathom was this robust reporting feature capability that was added to QuickBooks, but really was a separate add-on type of service. Well, they spent 2 years building out the reporting to make it a little bit better, and so now they're not using Fathom, so now it is integrated, right? So those are types of things that are happening and continue to happen. But I can say, as somebody who has relationships with many people at Intuit, having those add-ons in that marketplace is part of their actual strategy. Right. I mean, that's actually an intentional part of their strategy, to have these add-ons provide that solution and that robustness that they can't possibly build on their own.
Mm-hmm. I think one more point too is like, when we're thinking about how quickly technology evolves, like there's no way that Intuit could keep up with every business niche and, you know what I mean, being the best tool out there. Like startups are so innovative. We're seeing all this new technology come out at a rapid pace. And I think the apps, ecosystem really helps make sure that like, if you want to be one of those early adopters and really get that competitive edge from new technology, that you can, and that it can work with your tools and your data secure and all that kind of stuff.
You know what that kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of Adobe Reader. Do you remember Adobe Reader? Do you still use it? And remember, after a while, it almost took like 3 minutes to boot up, because it tried to be able to read everything under the sun, because everybody needed more. Oh, look, I need to have these CAD drawings being rendered in a very specific way. And they kept adding and adding and adding. And soon this Adobe Reader was so bloated, it would take forever to boot up. And all I wanted to do was look at this recipe. That's all I wanted to do, but it's taking 5 minutes. And then, people stopped using it and went to somewhere else that was a much quicker reader. That's just a story from Errol. Let's go on to the next question. I think that would be good. Is it possible, Denise is asking, for VRC to provide a monthly accounting review, Brad?
Yeah, there's actually a few ways of doing this. So, I mean, one, most typically, right, it's an annual review. Some clients we work with, they want more like a quarterly. So we're going more every 3 months and we're reviewing things. But absolutely, if you or another client says, hey, I want you looking at it monthly, we could absolutely do that. What I would say too is, for the folks that we're doing routine bookkeeping for, okay, so maybe we're the ones going in and coding and reconciling. We're doing that on a monthly basis every month anyways. So, one of the typical things that we'll do, we don't just go in and code and leave, but if we're the ones doing the bookkeeping, we typically don't need to add a file review to it because you're trusting us to make sure that it is done right. But yeah, we can absolutely help in that way as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Brad. Great question there, Denise. Yes, if there are last call for any other questions from the audience as I stall, and if nothing comes in, are there any last thoughts from either of you two? Oh, wait, no, I see something come in. Let's see. I think it was about incorporating apps more challenging for non-technical persons to work with QuickBooks on. And this is true. And the choice is overwhelming at times. And that's what makes it complicated in choosing these new apps to include within QuickBooks Online. Is there any advice that you could give if you're trying to find something, or how, as a new person to QuickBooks, just how best to navigate that environment?
Yeah, can I take that one?
Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, just a real quick thought on that one. Here's the good news. First off, let me respond to your point, which is true, right? Some of those integrations can be more technical, and obviously the people building these solutions are trying to make it as simple as possible. You click a button, you log in, and it just works. And I think some of the simpler solutions do work that way. But when you've got a more robust solution, there is some just inherent complexity to it. But what I would say, and I apologize in advance for this sounding very selfish, but as a solution provider for QuickBooks, we hear from hundreds of customers a year who are using these different services, right? Whether it's Bill.com versus Tipalti, or Right Networks for hosting versus GoToMyERP. We hear people that are using different apps, right? And just because we're in the business and we are talking with clients all the time, we know just sort of anecdotally that this one over here is not so great. This one over here is very good, very few complaints. And as a solution provider for QuickBooks, we would be the type of firm that I would recommend you reach out to for our recommendation. Okay, and we might recommend a specific solution. It might not be a perfect fit, in every case. But use the wisdom that we have as a company that's been in the industry for over 20 years to advise you. Okay, so that would be one. And then also, we are specialists in some types of integrations, and we can actually help do that technical work for you. We're not specialists in everything, and so we have folks that we outsource or recommend things to. But if you go to a solution provider for QuickBooks, you're going to get experienced and wise advice from a lot of them. And there's a number of solution providers out there.
Great, thank you so much. Let's continue on with a number of questions came in, so thank you for entering them. From Melinda, we have, what if adjustments made at review time affect sales tax reports that have already been submitted? Brad, I guess that's to you, maybe?
So say the question again.
What if adjustments made at review time affect sales tax reports that have already been submitted?
Well, obviously, that could be a complicated thing. If you've already filed, your sales tax return, if you've already paid it and find out there's a mistake, number one is to preferably contact your CPA and just make sure that they're in the loop, because they can help, guide you on that. Contact the state and say, hey, we made a mistake. They might have an amendment process, or they might just say, oh, that's fine, roll in that adjustment into the next period. So there's a couple different ways of handling it that it really does kind of depend on your state and maybe the severity of the adjustment as well.
Hopefully that answers your question. We have another one about I'm struggling to clear items out. For example, I have journal entries in my customer detail, accounts receivable. This is also on the accounts payable side. Does that make sense?
It does. The short answer is, and again, I hate to make just these big overarching statements because it doesn't apply to everybody in every case, but generally speaking, we don't recommend journal entries. And there's a reason why. They are the manual direct way of impacting your accounting, but QuickBooks in general is not meant to be used through journal entries as a normal thing, right? Yes, you can use them for adjustments. There are absolutely cases where they're really helpful, depreciation entries, things like that. But generally, we recommend using the built-in features instead of journal entries. So for example, if you've got an invoice, there's a payment transaction, there's a deposit transaction. In QuickBooks, there's a bill transaction, there's a bill payment transaction. So if we, and also as well as a bill credit transaction. We recommend using the built-in transactions because that typically keeps you from getting into those problems. The bottom line though is, yeah, if you've got journal entries and maybe you've done a journal entry to your checking account and accounts receivable, it's affecting the customer's balance, but it's not necessarily marking that invoice as paid, right? So there, you kind of have to go in after the fact, do your received payment, apply that journal entry to the invoice, and then it'll clear, right? So, and the same thing is kind of true on the bill and the bill payment side. You've got to go into the bill payment process, see the credit in the form of the journal entry, and apply it to the bill to clear out the bill. Those are types of things that when you're doing journal entries, you're just not using the built-in system so that things aren't quite as automatically cleared. And so we recommend using the built-in transactions in most cases.
Yeah, thank you, and that makes sense. Using what's built in, I totally get. For Elish from Julie, how do we make sure that how we are using Method is integrating with QuickBooks Desktop manufacturing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie. So we have a lot of clients who are in the manufacturing wholesale distribution space and also are on QuickBooks Desktop. I know a lot of you love using QuickBooks Desktop for kind of those more industry specific features that the desktop version has. So we totally hear you on there. In terms of syncing with QuickBooks Desktop, there's a variety of different fields that will sync either bidirectionally between QuickBooks and Method, or in some cases where it makes sense, just one way. So either QuickBooks Desktop to Method or Method to QuickBooks Desktop, whatever kind of makes sense there. In terms of the manufacturing stuff, I would have to double check just exactly what fields are syncing between. But if you are curious, you're more than welcome. I can reach out after the call and we can set up a chat and I can get those answers over to you. Errol, I don't know if you have anything to add on the QuickBooks Desktop syncing thing.
Nope, I think you covered it okay. It all just depends on what exactly they're looking for. So I would say, yeah, I think we're getting close to the end of time. We do have a copy of all these questions, and I think we do have everyone's email. So you will get a copy of this. You will get a copy of this webinar, and if there are further questions, we can reach out to you to answer them. We will, I think. What else was I going to say? I don't know. I just completely lost because I started reading things. But anyway, I think we're going to close it off because it is time. So thank you everyone for joining and for asking your questions. Thank you to Elish and thank you to Brad for your advice and your expertise. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. So take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.